broadly, there's a lot of conversation around historical changes, things that have been changing, everything, because the environment's been changing, so everything's changing with it, And so I think that there's a lot in the media about that, which is great.
Yeah.
But I also wonder, coming into another project that I have. Hi, Berta. This is my sister, Berta. This is Bathsheba Demuth, Lisa, and Patricia. And so I was talking about, in media, there's a lot of talk about changes, what's changing in the Arctic, what's changing in the world. But I also think what's interesting is to ask the question, in your work and in your research, what kinds of things have you seen that have stayed the same?
That's a really good question, and one that actually no one else has asked, because I think this obsession with change is so on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
They only want to know about climate change in every Q&A. I think one of the things that was really kind of revealing to me when I was writing this book and started to think about the kind of longer history of, outsiders or foreigners coming into the Bering Strait is the degree to which so many of the things that now, when you read about them in the news, kind of have this, everything is new, we've never seen this before, it's unprecedented, the apocalypse is coming, kind of freighted language about it, that if you look at, like the 1880s along the Bering Strait and what happened after the collapse of the walrus population due to commercial harvesting, which follows on the kind of enormous number of bowhead whales that were killed because of commercial harvesting, which comes alongside a series of epidemic diseases that come in from the outside. Like that kind of whole matrix of things that are introduced from the outside of the Bering Strait that people survived makes what's happening now look more like something that has come around before, rather than the first time there's ever been kind of a catastrophe on Earth. And in some ways, I think it's something that people who live in relatively privileged lower 48 communities, climate change is the first time they've ever had to think about changes on this scale. And as soon as you step outside those usually white upper-class communities, there are many places around the world where people, in fact, have lived through, figured out kind of strategies of survivance, learned how to give their children what they find really meaningful, even under these extraordinarily trying, awful times, and come out of it in some form. And so that seems like a thing that I wish there was more discussion of that when people were talking about climate change. Not that we don't need to take it seriously, and not that it doesn't need redress, but that it's not, we're not actually destined for a Mad Max movie unless we decide that that's what we want to do.
Yeah.
Like we have some agency in this picture. And that's actually not how, societies all around the world that have had to deal with sort of massive, uprooting, rapid change have, in fact, adapted to it in the past.
Yeah. I think that's been just a huge focus of the project that I'm working on now with my partner, Jenna. We interviewed a bunch of people in Utkarvik about the changes, but we wanted to also really make sure that we cover what we know that will or have stayed the same. And, for how long have those things stayed the same? For as long as we've been there.
Right.
And that, I feel like that's just an important part to highlight in the work that we do. For me as a Native woman, that we're not going to get wiped out, it's also very loom and doom, kind of media coverage to talk about climate change in the way that people are talking about it. But it's not just a story to us. We live there. That's our livelihood. That's, there are threats and issues with the things that are going on environmentally, but it's also like, I don't buy into the, we're not going to be here in 50 years or something like that,
No, I think there's something about that narrative of, it's a narrative of erasure. And I think that there is something really unexamined in the way that narrative is placed in the U.S. media back on Alaska Native communities without a lot of self-consciousness about the way that narrative has been operative in U.S. media since the dawn of the Republic.
Right.
That I wish there was a little bit more self-interrogation about that.
Yeah. In the book, you talk a lot about intersections and intersections between two different things. Sometimes, maybe it's Indigenous people versus Western people, or maybe then versus now, or like animals versus humans. What do you think was? Which one of these intersections do you think was the most profound? It's a big question.
Oh, that's such a good question. It's a big question.
Yeah,
that's like a philosophy of history question. No, it's a great one.
Okay.
I think the tempting thing to say is that it's the opposition between Indigenous and kind of outsider or foreigners arriving. But I also think that kind of puts too much emphasis on that being kind of the only set of things that changes. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I think that if I kind of push the timeline of this story back, it's much more one of the kind of ongoing negotiation or sometime conflict between people and the environments that they live in. That those kind of patterns actually trace much further back, and they change. Like the tenor of that relationship changes enormously when you introduce something like commercial whaling in the 19th century, or you introduce Soviet style, socialist reindeer farming in the 20th century. But they're different attempts to kind of figure out the ways in which people should live in the world. And in all of those cases, they're attempts in which it's not just people that matter in the long run. Mm-hmm. So it really does kind of come back to the ways in which various societies have set up the choices they make around having that relationship, and what counts as a good relationship with the world around you, and what counts as one that's kind of morally out of bounds, or too exploitative, or not exploitative enough, depending on, the Soviet view, which is kind of that you can never actually be, you can never use too much of a particular resource. Like you should always just use more. And then what happens? How do the environments kind of spring back from that or push back against it? And I wouldn't want to frame that as an opposition, because I don't think it has to be an opposition. And I think there are all sorts of precedents for ways societies have decided not to live in kind of an oppositional form, or have lived in opposition only in particular situations, rather than kind of constantly. But I think that kind of need to find a place within an environment is probably the fundamental thing.
I really enjoyed the holistic approach kind of to everything that you're talking about, through starting the story with, the eyes or the time of a beluga, in a certain season, and then incorporating the scientific data that comes with that, and then the time of commercialization of whaling and all of those things, all of them coming together, and tundra and ice, and all of those things together that people think about separately, kind of, and study sometimes separately. Right. But, growing up in a rural Alaskan village, none of those things were ever separate. All of those things were intertwined, and there was always like a holistic approach to life, really. And, so I really enjoyed that. It was like a culmination of all of those things in your book, which was really cool to read and to hear about. Kind of talking about maybe the loom and doom, getting back to the loom and doom. I had a listener, I kind of just really quickly before we got on, asked folks what they were interested in hearing, or if they had any questions for you. And one question was interesting. It was, what gives you hope for the future?
This is also a question I get a lot. Unlike the what hasn't changed question, the hope question comes up. And I actually realized this fall when I was talking about this book quite a lot and to lots of different audiences, and I started to get really frustrated with the question, what gives you hope? And I tried to figure out why I was getting frustrated. I was like, this is a totally fine question. Like what? And I realized it's because the way that we talk about hope in English is people ask what gives you hope, as if it's something that comes to you as a received thing. And my sense of where we are in terms of the kinds of social changes that need to be made in order to mitigate carbon emissions, like nothing's going to give that to us. We're going to have to make it. And that it was the verb form that was actually really annoying me. And so I think hope is a thing that you go out and you make by figuring out what it is that with your particular set of skills and talents and community it is that you can do to try to make the future the one that you want to live in and the future that you want your children to live in. And that's not going to be handed to you. Right. It's something that you kind of earn by going out and doing it. And then when I had that realization, it made me realize that that I also then need to stop asking for hope to be given to me and like figure out how to tie into a community, figure out where are the places that the things that I know how to do are useful to this discussion. What are the students how can I work with the students that I teach in order to help them achieve those things? So that does give me hope in the end. But that's my spiel about it.
Like actionable,
yes,
it's an actionable thing. It's not just...
It's not an abstract.
It's like
yeah.
It's no. Okay. And so I think my last question, and then we can go and ask if anybody else has any more questions, was, do you have any advice for the next generation? Do you have any advice for the next generation?
Of just humans in general?
How about for your students?
For my students?
Yeah.
This kind of goes back to the gloom and doomy question, but I have a lot of students, because I teach subjects that have to do with the environment, and so I have a lot of students come to my office and say, what is it that I can do? And I think the good thing about the scale of the challenge that figuring out how to have an economy that's not based on carbon puts in front of us is that really whatever it is that you're good at, there's a place out there that needs that skill set. That the world is interested and available for the thing that you're good at. So it's not like just the engineers are going to fix this, or right. just the poets, or just the climate scientists. It's going to take that whole community of people. And so in that case, it's really more figuring out what it is that you as a person and what it is that the community that you come from are good at and need, and kind of try to put those things together. Because I do think, we all have different inclinations. If I went out and tried to be a statistician, which my brother is, it wouldn't be good for the world. I wouldn't contribute very much if that's what I decided to do. And he can. So, there's room for both of those things. So, that's kind of general advice. And it's a little bit find your dreamy, but I think in a more kind of rooted sense of not just find what your dream is, but find what you're good at and find who the people are that you can support with that, so that it's not just a solo endeavor. Because I think so much of the messaging that my students get in college is about what do you as one sole human being want to do? And that's not actually how we live. And right. It's not a great way to make decisions about what you want to do, because you're never doing it alone, hopefully. If you are, it's often isolating and sad. Yeah. And even something like writing a book, which, one name goes on the cover, but there's not just one village, there's a whole lot of villages that go into that operation. So kind of finding that community connection.
Did you have anything else that you think that is important to add? Or, if I didn't ask anything specific, but you really wanted to get into it?
No, those were really good questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I worked all morning on them. I was like, I need to get these questions nailed down. Anybody else? Great. You guys have anything that you'd like to add or have any questions? Bodil?
I'd like to say thank you. Oh, sorry. Hi,